We'll continue the conversation about that meeting of alleged fake electors that George Chidi said he stumbled into. For that, we want to bring in Chief Investigative Reporter Brendan Keith to really talk about these alleged fake electors, Brendan, because you've certainly done a lot of research. You've talked a lot about this, delved very deep into the grand jury and the findings and the findings that have possibly come out today. But what can you tell us about these alleged fake electors?
Well, we know there are 10 indictments, right? We just heard that. So there's these 10 indictments, and those can have subordinate charges to them. So there are really 10 cases with possible multiple charges. But what we know from the target letters and also from the preservation of evidence notices that Fani Willis sent out as far back as the beginning of 2021 when she first took office, we know what charges they were looking at, and one of them is this so-called fake electors or alternate electors scheme. Now, the reason we call it a scheme is because that's what those who are accusing say it was. The Trump campaign and the Trump supporters say this was merely a meeting of Trump electors as alternates should he prevail in court. This was a meeting in December 14th of 2020. That's when all of the electors in all of the state capitals across the nation, they were all meeting to essentially vote in the Electoral College and then pass those votes on to Washington. This is usually a pro forma thing. Even though it's in the Constitution, we don't usually pay that much attention to it. But this time, everybody did because the presidency was hanging in the balance. There was an effort, obviously, to affect which of those sets of ballots were counted in Washington. You remember all the pressure on Mike Pence to, not count one state, but count another? That's what this was all about, and Georgia was at the center of it. Georgia was one of 7 states that had these so-called fake or alternate electors meeting in the state capitol, or tried to. In some places like Michigan, they weren't allowed in. The Michigan Trump electors have already been indicted there on state charges, including forgery and essentially committing a fraud, saying they were the duly elected electors for Michigan when they weren't because, of course, Joe Biden won Michigan, just like in Georgia. So that is why that was a focus of the grand jury here as well. And it could be, we don't know yet, but could be one of those sets of 10 indictments that we know have been handed up by the grand jury. We know there were 0 no bills because reporters have seen the cover page in the clerk's office. One important note, because you're wondering, wait, why are we talking about indictments? We don't know what they are yet. Right now, we do know that the clerk's office is processing those indictments. And this is standard. It takes 1 to 3 hours. I know that's infuriating, but it can take 1 to 3 hours, even when expedited, to get those things in, scan them, stamp them. The clerk has to certify that, it's kind of an old process, goes back centuries, and they still do it on paper. And then they will scan that paper into the system. And then once they do, copies will be distributed to the reporters there and then also uploaded to a special link that we are refreshing and monitoring right now. So don't fear that you're missing that information. But we do suspect that one of those indictments could be these fake electors in Georgia. Now, why would it be a crime? It's important to point out that of those 7 states, 2 did not certify. Those Trump electors didn't say, oh, I'm the duly elected elector for the state of Pennsylvania, for example. That was one of the 2 states. They inserted language into their certification saying, these are provisional ballots. This is in case Donald Trump prevails in court. That didn't happen in Georgia and 4 other states. So in 5 states, including Georgia, the Trump electors signed their name to a document that says, we are the duly elected electors for the state of Georgia. They signed those documents, they sent them to the archives, the U.S. archives in Washington, D.C., and they also sent them to the Senate to be counted as ballots, as the official ballots from the state of Georgia. Now, the idea was, according to all of the information that's been gathered, the totality of the circumstances, which may also play into the potential RICO charges if those are part of the indictments, is that there was a plan to have those fake electors essentially muddy the waters. That when Mike Pence got up there to open the ballots from each of the states, there would be 7 states, including Georgia, that had 2 sets of competing ballots, 2 competing slates. And he could either choose the Donald Trump one, which was not certified by Governor Kemp, or he could just say, you know what, I can't determine which of these is authentic, so therefore, I'm not going to count that state at all. The vice president, who's the president of the Senate, did not have that power, and that's what Mike Pence asserted, and that's why he didn't do this. But had he done it, and this is the important point wrapping up here, is that had he essentially discounted those 6 or 7 states with competing sets of ballots, what would have happened is it would have been thrown to the House of Representatives, because if nobody gets 270 electoral votes, the House of Representatives picks the president. And at that point, it was 26-24 in terms of state delegations where it could have gone toward Donald Trump, except that one state, Wyoming, only had 1 representative, and that was Liz Cheney, unlikely to vote for President Trump. It would have gone 25-25. It never came to that, but because they certified that they were the duly elected electors of the state of Georgia, that could make it criminal, that could make it forgery, and it could be one of the indictments we are expecting to see tonight.
And Brendan, you mentioned the quote unquote fake electors in Michigan who have already been indicted on state charges there. We'll have to wait and see if any of the Georgians who were a part of that face any charges when we read more about these indictments. But they include some pretty prominent people who are currently serving in government here in the state, including our lieutenant governor.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because some of these defendants, or I guess you could say people who were investigated, who are these alternate or fake electors, actually entered into immunity agreements with the district attorney. So they agreed to cooperate with the district attorney and were provided immunity from those state charges as a result of that cooperation. We think David Schaefer wasn't one of them. He was the chair of the GOP in the state of Georgia, and he, was essentially one of the leaders of that meeting. And that's the meeting that George Chidey was talking about, where he walked in and they said, "Oh, this is an education meeting. You can't be here. You've got to get out." Hey, look, we go into committee meetings all of the time, and I've never been kicked out of a committee meeting at the state capitol, so that was unusual. And then they were invited back in. A number of those so-called alternate or fake electors will not face charges, at least in Georgia, because they do not, they have immunity, so they can't be charged by Fani Willis, but others could be charged. And you're right, one of the people we're talking about is our current lieutenant governor, and I guess we'll see soon. But again, these clerks are working hard. They're also working overtime tonight, but 1 to 3 hours when we know indictments have been handed up and we just don't know what they are yet.
Burt Jones is the name of the lieutenant governor who is alleged to have taken part in that fake elector scheme. We'll see if his name is attached to any of the indictments as we begin to learn more about them. Thanks, Brendan.